Coming into a new mythology or lore can be daunting, especially if you're coming to it late, whether it be the likes of the Silmarillion by Tolkien or something as common as Norse mythology. It's a little bit daunting, more than a little bit, and it's intimidating. So what I would like to do today is I'd like to introduce you to the lore of Magic the Gathering. Now hang on. If you are a fan of Magic the Gathering, this will be an introduction to the story. Now the story is told in two facets, and we'll get to that in a minute. And I plan to do more of these lore introductions on both real-world mythologies as well as the lores of beloved, old and new, modern mythologies. So if you're ready, I would say grab a drink, grab a seat. I've got a story for you. Welcome back, wayward children, to my humble hovel. Let's get you back in touch with your nerd roots. I am Castle, this is my tavern, and here we talk about myth and lore and tales of yore, usually a set of stories handed down through my family. But today we are discussing the lore of the long-standing and beloved property of Wizards of the Coast, Magic the Gathering. Now, some of you may be thinking to yourselves, well, this isn't going to be very interesting. I'm not interested in Magic. I don't know anything about it. I don't play the game. Believe me when I say you do not need to play the game, or even want to play the game, to love a good story. Now, the story of Magic is sporadic. There is a lot of it. There is so much to go over, and there are so many characters to love and to hate, to adore and to mourn. But this video is going to be an introduction to the lore and everything you need to know to enjoy the story. We're going to go over the language, we're going to go over how the story is told, and we're going to go over what you should be paying attention to. So join me, if you will, as we talk about first how the story of Magic the Gathering is told. It's told in exactly two ways. You get the cards, which have pictures as well as flavor text that tell little tidbits of the story. Every set has a series of cards in it, and those cards make up the story of what is going on during that time period in that set. Think of the sets as chapters in a book. They are eras in history. They mark important events in the world of Magic. And then there are actual books, there are blurbs, there are comic books, and there is a short, Magic Daily series that Wizards of the Coast puts out on their website. Now, it can get to be very daunting and confusing, and the lore is incredibly inconsistent. The cards sometimes don't agree with the books, and the books sometimes tell a story that is nowhere on the cards, and vice versa. So if you are approaching this on your own, it would in fact be daunting. So what you do when you are approaching the story as a newbie is just enjoy the subtle details and nuances, because every set after a certain point in Magic the Gathering references some other intellectual property, whether it be mythology as in the state of Kaldheim being an entire set, as well as a plane. Remember that word plane, because we're going to come back to it. That is inspired by Norse mythology. And then you have Kaladesh, which is a plane and a set that is heavily inspired by the cyberpunk clockwork sort of motif and the ancient technologies of India. They are spectacular, and there's so much for us to go over, but all you need to know for this part is that the story is told both on the cards and on the books, and while they don't always agree, they always have a spectacular tale to tell. Now, the next thing that you need to know is the word planes and Planeswalkers. Planes are very simple to understand, but they get to be incredibly complex. The planes in Magic the Gathering are the different realms. They are different areas of existence. Think of them as different worlds. They are the multiverse of Marvel. They are the realms of Norse mythology. And actually, ironically, there are realms within realms in Kaldheim. The planes are what are referred to as the blind eternities. There is an infinite number of planes, and they do have a beginning, but that's a story for another time. There are an infinite number of planes, but we primarily focus on a few for the stories of the modern Magic tale. Now, you've heard me say planes and planeswalkers, and you must be thinking to yourself, Castle, what in the hell is a planeswalker? Well, it's exactly like what it sounds. It is a person who is capable of walking through the planes. And these come in two varieties. Now, planeswalkers, prior to an event called the Mending, which was Magic the Gathering's way of sort of retconning the power of planeswalkers. Planeswalkers prior to that were essentially gods. They could walk between the planes, but they could also shapeshift. They had so many incredible abilities, but I'm not going to get your hopes up too much for that, because in all of the modern story they have very much been nerfed by the universe itself. And planeswalkers are essentially magic users. They're usually mages of some kind, and they have the ability to walk between planes, and they are the main characters of our story, at least on the usual. Most of the time we follow planeswalkers through their adventures, sometimes through their struggles, and even through wars and great tragedies. Magic the Gathering loves its tragedies, and it writes them fairly well. Now, the stories themselves are not always incredibly well written, but they are always very nicely structured when combined with the story that is being told in the books as well as on the cards. So, just a quick recap. Planes are the infinite number of worlds in the Magic universe, not dissimilar from the multiverse in Marvel, if not just a little bit more confusing. And planeswalkers are incredible and powerful, both evil and morally ambiguous characters that can walk between the planes. I'm going to introduce you to two real quick, just so you can get an idea. One of my all-time favorites, and a fan favorite, is the planeswalker Liliana Vess. Liliana Vess was a healer on her home plane of Dominaria. Now, Dominaria is one you will want to remember, because that's where a big portion of the Magic story takes place. But we won't go too deep into that into this video. In her home plane of Dominaria, she was a healer, and through an unfortunate turn of events, she becomes a necromancer after turning her brother, Josu Vess, into a lich. He is very ill, and she tries to heal him using ill-gotten magics, and this does two things. It transforms him into an undead general of the undead, and it ignites her spark, cementing her magic as no longer being for healing, but instead being for control over the dead. Now, you may be asking yourself, Castle, what the hell are you talking about? You said it ignited her spark. Well, that's a nice transition, oh dear audience member, into what makes a planeswalker a planeswalker. Now, planeswalkers are the only people who are aware of the blind eternities, and the recent story tells us that's because they are born with a small bit of the blind eternities inside of them. Now, whether this happens on purpose or because it is preordained, we don't really know. There are about 1 in every 3 million people who are born with a spark inside of them, and 1 in every several 100,000 of them has that spark ignite through emotional trauma or distress, usually and most commonly during their own death or the death of a loved one. In the instance of Liliana Vess, it was when she accidentally killed and resurrected her brother as a monster. And when the spark ignites for a planeswalker, they take a random planeswalk. Yes, random. They go to a random plane in the blind eternities, and then they have to figure out how to get back. And sometimes this is very pleasant for them, and most of the time it is not. And this is where most of our original stories take place, in the first planeswalk of each of the planeswalkers that we see. With the exception of one of my absolute favorite characters, Karn. Now, when you look at Liliana, you're like, well, that's a relatively normal human person. And then I am now contrasting her to Karn, the Silver Golem. Karn goes back to almost the very beginning of the Magic the Gathering story, almost as far back as we can see. He is one of the oldest creatures in the Magic universe, and he was created by one of the original Planeswalkers. Now, I'm not going to overburden you guys with these too much, but Karn is a wonderful and beautiful, endearing character who was made an automaton and slowly but surely became a man. He is Magic the Gathering's Pinocchio. He was made by a hubris-filled Geppetto and then became man, and now he sort of just wanders the blind eternities helping people. And when we meet him in a very recent story called War of the Spark, he is trying to liberate a bunch of sentient robots like himself. I know this is probably confusing, but let's get back to it. Planeswalkers have the blind eternities made into them, and then when that blind eternity ignites, they can walk between the planes. Simple enough, right? Now, here's where it gets very interesting. The beginning of time has two groups dubbed into it, and we're not going to go deeply into them. You have two groups that date back almost to the beginning of the Magic universe. You have the Equilorians, who we will never hear about and almost never talk about, so I'm not going to go too deep into them, but they are the oldest existing group in all of the Magic story. And then you have the Thran. The Thran are the foundation for all technology in the Magic universe. They are the ancients of this world, and they have a boogeyman who accompanies them called the Phyrexians. Now, the Phyrexians come from a plane of living metal and oil, and their whole and entire purpose is to turn everything into a Phyrexian. Anything that they can touch. And because of the Thran and some other persons, they end up finding out that there are other planes that they can travel to, and in light of this, they then want to spread the oil of Phyrexia everywhere. And that makes up the big boogeyman of most of all of Magic's story, at least for the early bit. Later on, we get into the dragons, and the dragons are where it gets truly fascinating and truly crazy. So, what you need to know to understand the Magic story. Dragons are incredibly important. There's a lot of very interesting technology. There are multiple worlds called planes, and persons who can walk between them called planeswalkers. And unless you are a planeswalker, generally, you have no idea that any other planes exist other than the one that you live on, and people live happily ignorant of the fact that there are an infinite number of planes out there, and live generally very happy. Most of our stories take place either on a plane called Zendikar, which has a lot of elves on it, a plane called Dominaria, which is very Earth-like. It's essentially Earth, but about 3 times bigger map-wise. You have Innistrad, which is the living embodiment of all gothic horror. You have your mummies and vampires and abominatory creatures, and it is absolutely one of the best planes in all of Magic the Gathering. And then you have the dragons, specifically the Dragon, who was the first primordial dragon who spawned all other dragons throughout time, and would be the father of all dragons on almost every single plane. And again, that's a story for another time. So what I'm going to do for these videos is my next one, I'm going to introduce you to the most common planeswalkers and give you a little bit of their backstory. Then we'll talk about the planes that each one of those Planeswalkers is from, and then depending on what you guys would like to do, we will go into the individual stories of each Planeswalker, and I will make them as linear as possible so that you guys can enjoy the story and get to know and love and hate these characters as I do. In the meantime, I hope you have enjoyed this little bit of lore. I bid thee join the clan if you have, and you'll do so by engaging that subscribe button in Mortal Kombat. You will know you have won when all the blood drains from its body, and it becomes a deathly grey. Conveniently located to its right is the victory bell, which you can ring to let all know of your victory over the subscribe button. And as a bonus, you'll also always know when I upload a video. Down in the Sporran section, you'll find links to my podcast, purchasables, and platforms, and lower in the kilt section, you can have a conversation, you can ask questions, you can talk, you can request videos, you can leave compliments if you like. And more than anything, you can engage in the art of storytelling yourself, leaving your favorite stories from Magic or from your favorite bit of lore from around the world or from any given fiction, and we can all enjoy these stories together, my friends. But tonight, I hope you have enjoyed your drink, because tonight, the stories, as every night, were on me. Stay bloodthirsty, my friends, and remember, all hail the Black Dragons.